This season will likely be not only shorter than the previous ones, but it will also have a higher density of Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum games, simply because I'm running out of nostalgia games to talk about on other platforms. So it's time for the 11th serving of C64 games now, starting with Bally Midway's Spy Hunter from 1983, which was originally released as a cartridge and disc in the United States by Sega, and of course the European tape version was imported by US Gold, as they usually did in those days. This is one of the most classic and earliest top-down vehicular combat games, which still feels rather original to this day, and I think the reason why it has stayed such a unique experience is because of its use and introduction of additional weapons. You start with a machine gun, and you can basically shoot most of anything that comes along, although some vehicles are not your enemies, so you get no score for shooting them, and some vehicles require bumping them off the road because guns will not affect them. Getting new weapons into your spy vehicle happens by driving into trucks that happen by every once in a while. The weapon upgrades include an oil dispenser, a thick smoke-laying machine, and a rocket launcher which you can use to destroy helicopters. At certain points, you also get to commandeer a speedboat, so it's a game largely designed after the Bond movies with Roger Moore, just without the license. To me, Spy Hunter was always first and foremost a C64 experience. Even after getting to play the original arcade version through emulation, the C64 version remained the more likely one I would come back to, because it felt more playable. The thing is, the arcade version uses a gearbox with 2 gears, the higher of which makes the car impossibly fast, and sooner rather than later it's impossible even to get your car started before you get destroyed by an enemy coming from behind. Sure, the C64 version is what I grew up with, but from all that I've seen, it's the one I will stick with henceforth. Another arcade classic that I always felt more comfortable with on the C64 is Atari's Paperboy, which was ported to most home computers by Elite Systems in 1986. Sure, it's a bit ugly and the music gets super repetitive after a few levels, but then it's one of those games that you never really play more than 2 or 3 times at most on each session. At least that's the way it has always been for me. That's not to say the C64 version of Paperboy is a bad game, not at all. Rather, when it comes to arcade conversions, it's slightly above average. The viewing distance in this diagonal view is perhaps somewhat inconvenient, but because the game is designed to play exactly the same on each run, it's easy to memorize everything that goes on in the game, at least as far as you can bother. Because part of the game's charm is just throwing newspapers randomly at things to gain better score while you destroy windows, tombstones and whatnot, the actual mission often gets thrown aside. Your job is to deliver papers to those houses that have the paper ordered, which you see as mailboxes somewhere in the front yard. You can basically progress in the game with just one subscriber, but to gain better score you can also force the newspaper upon the non-subscribers by successfully throwing a paper into a designated area on a house without a mailbox. Getting through the street and biking your way through the stunt track over to the office is one of the coolest bonus level designs I can remember from the 80s, and it's one of the things that kept me hooked on the game. It's not perfect by any means, but it is very nostalgic and worth revisiting. From the batch of 50 original games that I got for my C64 soon after the actual computer was given as a Christmas present, which I've mentioned earlier in the series a few times, I have selected a few more examples for today's list, starting with Epyx's amazing motorcycle racing game Super Cycle from 1986. This was also one of those games that I first saw as a video recording on VHS with the annoying tape loading segments cut off, but despite the annoying tape loading segments between each stage, I always thought, and still do, that Super Cycle is quite easily the best motorcycle racing game, particularly of the behind view kind, that was ever released on the C64. Although you do get to choose your bike's color and your outfit, as well as one of 3 difficulty levels, Super Cycle doesn't try to be anything more than absolutely necessary. The in-game graphics are just about as simplistic as you get in Pole Position, although you do get a much nicer info display for the bottom half of the screen, and your bike has 3 gears instead of 2. The game goes through a long series of increasingly difficult road segments in different looking areas, with other bikers racing with you, although you basically race against the time for the entire game. Some segments feature inconveniences such as oil puddles and traffic cones to separate roadwork lanes from drivable lanes, and then you get bonus segments that are just straight roads with flags you need to touch to get bonus score. When you think about the time of Supercycle's release, the only game that it had as a real competition was Sega's Hang-On from the previous year, which was never ported to the C64 nor any of the usual 8-bit computers. That is likely the primary reason for the existence of this game, because Supercycle is also available on Spectrum, Amstrad and Atari ST, so there is a high probability that I will be writing a comparison of this sometime in the near future. But time will tell. I have always liked computerized pinball games, and my first such experience was Synapse Software's amazing 1984 game, Slamball. To my knowledge, this is still the only completed and officially released pinball game on the C64, which has a scrolling screen and several distinct sections in the table. Mind you, there is only one table, but so did many other pinball games at the time. Slamball has a strange, eerie feel about it. The table is somewhat sparse in its design with barely any decorations, but enough action to keep you going at it. Hitting the bonus multiplier changes the table's color, which is a nice effect. There's a constant but silent background music which barely registers, as it's a low humming, tuneless tune that feels awkward in the mix and gives the game an ominous feel. The ball has a face which is smiling for as long as it's doing its business properly, but the bottom of the table has teeth and it chews up the ball when you fail to catch it with the flippers, which is when the ball turns green and its face turns sour while getting chewed up. Before Pinball Dreams and Fantasies on the Amiga, Slamball used to be my most revisited pinball game, along with David's Midnight Magic, and it's still my absolute favorite on the C64. Highly recommended. Now here's a game that I got hooked on pretty heavily, mostly thanks to its amazing soundtrack. Frantic Freddie from 1983 was, even upon its release, a rather old-school game of collecting items from a room of ladders and monsters, except the ladders were two-sided, which made a great difference in playability. The quick gameplay and funny animations helped the game make it worth playing, but as I said, it's the soundtrack that really kept me going at it. Most of it is sit covers of hit songs from the prior decade or so, and some other classics. The title screen features a version of Queen's Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which to me points out clearly that the creator must have been a Queen fan to name the title character thusly. Who knows, really? During the game, you get Boogie Fever from the Silvers, Electric Light Orchestra's Don't Bring Me Down, Walter Murphy's A Fifth of Beethoven, and Kodachrome from Paul Simon, just to name a few. I've never reached the end of this game, because at some point the enemies start acting so aggressively towards you that you're gonna need a strategy that I have never figured out. Which is probably why I still play Frantic Freddie semi-regularly. It's a simple game to pick up, practically impossible to master, but thanks to the soundtrack it's more than usually addicting game of its genre. Another game that I had early on in my C64 games collection was a racing game that I should have been more impressed by at the time, but I wasn't. It's Jeff Crammond's first entry into the world of racing games called Revs, which was originally written and published on the BBC Micro. The problem was, this was a keyboard-based racing simulator, and I had no instructions for it because the guy who I got this from, and the 49 other games, had lost the manual. Well, it took a while to get the game to play, and my elder brother was a bit more enthusiastic about Revs than I was, so he eventually figured out the keys to play. Next, the virtual Formula 3 vehicle needed to have its wings angled properly so that it wouldn't slip and slide around one of the two available tracks. To this day, I don't think I've really tried Brands Hatch more than once or twice, because Silverstone was the easier one to memorize. Anyway, once we determined that the car was ready to be driven without too much of problems, The next problem we realized was that the game runs too slowly to be able to actually control the car as comfortably as an actual race would require. Fast forward about 30 years or so, and I find out why the BBC Micro version is actually better, while writing a comparison of the game. I rarely actually loaded Revs from the original tape, because I was too frustrated with the uncomfortable keyboard controls and slow first-person polygon-based graphics, but finding the upgraded version, Revs Plus, with more tracks and joystick controls, did make me play the game a little bit more. Another problem with the game had to do with the fact that our C64 was the newer model with the 8580 SID chip, which means that the engine noises would play much quieter than the tire squeals, so if our TV was set to a regular volume level according to most other games, we couldn't hear the engine, but if we turned up the volume enough to hear the engine, the tire squeal would destroy our ears. In other words, Revs is definitely a game to be enjoyed on the old model C64, although the BBC Micro original is still more preferable. Still, it does offer a hefty amount of nostalgia for me, if only for its faults. The so-called arena fighter genre wasn't something that the C64 had too many representatives of, if only because the genre didn't really take off properly until 1986. Konami's early entry into the range of one-on-one fighters, the next to impossible to correctly pronounce Yie Ar Kung-Fu, is not nearly the first representative of the genre, but it is the game that introduced energy meters into the game, rather than being hit-based fights, as they used to do with Karate Champ, International Karate, and The Way of the Exploding Fist. Unless I'm mistaken, Yie Ar Kung-Fu also seems to be the first martial arts game to feature fighters with some sort of supernatural powers in addition to their basic fighting moves. At the very least, this was prior to the original Street Fighter, but I'm not sure if there was anything else of this kind around in 1986. You play as Urong, a fighter with only a very high jump as his special ability. The way I learned to play this game was through a tip given to me by the game's previous owner, who mentioned that if you use a joystick with an auto-fire function, you can easily perform serial hits of jump kicks or other moves, and certain early opponents are next to impossible to clear without this cheat. The fourth opponent in particular, Pole, is a notoriously unfair character to beat, and even with auto-fire you need to be very exact in your timing of jumps and low kicks to finish him before you take any hits. If you do take one hit, it's very likely that Paul will do a full serial attack on you on the spot and you'll lose a life in an instant. Honestly, even the final opponent, Blues, who mimics your every move, is less difficult to deal with. It's these kind of tricks and memories of learning that make Yie Ar Kung-Fu such a special game to me, but it is a genuine classic in its original arcade form. Not a bad C64 game either, once you learn the tricks. You can learn more about Yie Ar Kung-Fu's different versions by following the link to the comparison in the video description. I mentioned Blue Max in my earliest 8-bit Atari episode back in 2019, although I could have easily mentioned it in the connection to either the C64 or ZX Spectrum instead. Well, that bird has flown, but I can still mention the sequel, Blue Max 2001, because I played this one almost as much on the C64 as I did the first game. Not because I enjoyed this as much, but it felt different, yet similar enough to deserve some attention. First off, the screen scrolls in a different direction, or perhaps you could say the viewpoint is different. Secondly, the futuristic aircraft you are controlling is basically what you could call a classic-style UFO, a round, slightly indescribable hovering figure, which gave you the ability to actually stop the screen from scrolling mid-flight and land the device anywhere you wanted, whenever it was possible. Otherwise, the gameplay is similar enough. Shoot at everything you can and bomb the ground level elements until you get bored of it. To some people, this was too much of a departure from the original, but it never bothered me that much, and I said as much when I wrote a comparison of both Blue Max games back when I was just starting the blog in 2013. A link to that 2-for-1 comparison is also in the video description if you care to take a look how much less of a bother those early comparisons were. Yet another 1984 game that I have written a comparison of some considerable number of years ago is Sierra Online's early runner-style classic, BC's Quest for Tires, which was based on the Stone Age BC comic strip. I do sort of vaguely remember reading these comics from some magazines, but I don't think I ever really thought much of them until running across this game and its sequel, Grog's Revenge. Perhaps I'll talk more about that in a later episode. But the first game, Quest for Tires, is a pretty straightforward automatically scrolling platforming game of sorts where you avoid things by jumping and dodging. Although this game can be run through rather easily in just a couple of minutes, it is surprisingly long with no less than 10 consecutive sections. Your first run starts with Thor riding his stone unicycle at 10 units of distance per an undetermined unit of time, and the subsequent playthroughs add 10 each to the minimum speed. Your maximum speed is 80, which I have come to realize is comfortable enough, at least in the C64 version. Quest for Tires is a nice little arcadey challenge, which never ceases to charm with its simplistic cartoony graphics and extremely replayable set of segments. The only annoying thing about the game is the bit where you need to jump over a puddle of water using floating turtles, while a club-wielding character whose actual name in the comics is apparently Fat Broad is waiting to bonk your head with a club on the other side, because the turtles can sometimes order themselves in such a way to make it practically impossible for you to cross the puddle and not get hit by Fat Broad. Other than that, I can highly recommend it. We end this episode with the obligatory Finnish game, which again is one of the first games that I ever actually saw and played on the C64 before I even had my own. This is Zamzara, written by the legendary Jukka Tapanimäki in 1988 and apparently not released until 1989, which I find a bit odd, since I distinctly remember playing this game in 1988 before I got my own C64 that Christmas. Well, of course it could have been a preview version that was leaked out before it ever got released, but it's impossible to remember in any detail anymore. Anyway, Zamzara is a strategic action platformer in which you play as an alien with some sort of floating abilities and a number of different weapons that you need to learn how to use effectively in various situations. It has a certain distinctive hues and quality to it that just cannot be found from any other publisher, including music by the legendary Maniacs of Noise. I wrote a Finnish retro game review of this one in 2020, in which I dig deeper into the game's various preview versions and the official final release version, if you want to check it out. Zamzara is a difficult game, but easy to like if you're a fan of unique games like myself, and for me it's one of the best C64 games from Finland during the classic period.